What I will be talking about today is following those lines of diversity that Victoria was mentioning, being able to embrace neurodiversity. So looking at typical development to autism spectrum disorder. And so for our learning objectives today, we will be identifying early developmental milestones during infancy and early childhood, and then exploring more kind of deviance from that typical development. So developmental delays and neurodevelopmental disorders, so kind of briefly touching on that. And then more specifically looking at autism spectrum disorder and the different diagnostic criteria that kind of go with that. And then taking all of that information and applying it to a clinical assessment case. So before I jump into that, I know that we all have our own stories, our own journeys as to where we are today. And so I wanted to share a piece of mine. So for my family, my grandparents and ancestors were from southeastern China in a city called Guangzhou. And then during the 1920s, 1930s, there's a lot of turmoil in terms of the communists taking over there and the economic difficulties that came from that. And so my family on both sides ended up immigrating to South Vietnam. And then in South Vietnam, the Vietnam War happened there and the communists took over there. And so what ended up happening was at this time, that's when my parents met each other, got married, my oldest sister was born, some other relatives as well. So they all ended up escaping as refugees, so boat people, to a refugee camp in Malaysia. And then at that time, they were trying to figure out which country to settle in. And funny thing was that I could have been an Australian farmer because that was one of the options, but they heard about the US and that American dream and these opportunities, so on and so forth. And so on my dad's side in particular, they ended up going to California. And then a side bit, my mom's side went to Toronto, Canada. So I was born and raised in Orange County, California. And there was where I attended my undergrad at UCI, so the University of California, Irvine. And for me, actually, jumping into undergrad, I actually really wanted to be a veterinarian. I thought during the senior year of high school, I wanted to be it. I was like taking care of my dog, trying to measure him, weigh him, figure out all those things. And so once I started undergrad, I thought, actually, I don't think I want to do this. And so it was a lot of trying to explore what kind of occupations, careers, and then it hit me in the middle of undergrad as I was taking courses in psychology as well. I thought, like, wait a minute, I actually really want to do psychology. And so that's when I made the switch, majored in psychology, and then minored in biology. So with all of that, so taking that experience, thinking of myself as a second generation Asian American, thinking about my family, and all these different cultural things that we have to think about, I ended up pursuing a PhD in counseling psychology at the University of Iowa. And, and then there, I had some clinical experiences on the side, so that's part of our graduate curriculum. And I realized that I felt drawn towards the hospital setting. I didn't know what it was, but I realized for my journey throughout my academic career, following my gut was something that worked really well for me. And so I ended up doing this assessment practicum during my second year of clinical work with kids, doing assessment with ADHD, learning differences, so on and so forth. And then I realized it clicked. It's like, I really like this. I realized that I liked it a lot in terms of the structure that it entailed, and also just how powerful assessments can be in terms of coming up with diagnoses and being able to ultimately be the gatekeeper in terms of services that a child can have. So with that, like what Victoria was mentioning, I was matched to the University of Missouri's Health Sciences Psychology Consortium, and that involved me being in the pediatric neuropsychology track, and that involved also being in sites including the Thompson Center for Neurodevelopmental Disabilities or Disorders and Autism as well as the Women's and Children's Hospital there. And I wanted to continue this pursuit of pediatric neuropsychology. And so that was when I was matched to the Texas Children's Hospital / Baylor College of Medicine's Pediatric Neuropsychology postdoctoral fellowship. And so it was a 2-year fellowship. And I really appreciated the different kind of diversity that I was able to get in Houston in terms of diversity, in terms of racial, ethnic diversity, linguistic diversity as well. And then also being able to take all that information that I gained in Iowa and Missouri, especially when it came to more rural populations and just different social class, all these different factors that we can think of. So taking all of that, I was really interested in continuing to pursue my goal of serving communities of color. And so that was where I participated in the American Psychological Association's Minority Fellowship Programs, Psychology Summer Institute. And so what that is that in DC, I was able to be at the APA headquarters for a week. And it was an intense professional development mentoring experience, being able to focus on a certain project that I wanted to pursue and getting all this great mentorship from psychologists. It's kind of one of those like nerding out moments where I'm like, oh my gosh, you are blank and you're right in front of me. So I still have been able to get those connections and foster those, especially during these times, especially the things that have been happening in the news as well. And so I was able to bring that back to Texas Children's Hospital. And then what, like Victoria was mentioning, I recently completed my postdoctoral fellowship there and starting a private practice position. And so I'll be seeing my first patients next week. So that will be very exciting, being able to take all that knowledge and help serve the communities here in Houston. Okay, so what we'll do is go ahead and jump into early developmental milestones. I know that for the sake of just time and as much as information I want to pack in here, I'm focusing more on those early developmental milestones where it can pertains from infancy to early childhood, so 5 years old. So the information that I have taken this section from comes from the CDC primarily, and that is a website that I highly recommend in terms of looking at developmental milestones. There's a lot of great information in terms of what to expect from different ages, and these are just kind of like guidelines. So it's kind of like this many months, give or take, things like that. And then there's also resources available in different languages as well. So not only Spanish, but Chinese, Vietnamese, Bengali, Somali, Korean, Portuguese, Arabic, a lot of different resources. So I think that's just something that I highly recommend checking out. And if there's people that you know that are interested in those resources, feel free to share it. So this part is kind of taking an excerpt from the CDC website. So we'll start with the developmental milestones at 2 months old. So the way that I'll be describing is different domains. So the social and emotional part, this is where for typically developing kids that they begin to smile at people. They end up paying attention to faces. They're noticing there's a difference between faces and not face, like a design or something. They start to make eye contact with others. When it comes to more of their language and communication, this is where they start cooing. So it's like the ahs, the ohs, the es, like those vowel sounds. And then they also kind of alert to sounds as well. So if there's like a rattle shaking, then they'll turn to it, being able to attend to that. Again, with that kind of cognitive part. So paying attention to faces, also visually tracking. So then if they see a caregiver like walking across the room, they'll be able to track that. So moving their eyes towards that object. In terms of more of that physical development and movement, this is a time where instead of their limbs being more jerky, they're starting to get more control and having more smoother movements. And then also with the benefit of tummy time, being able to hold their head up more, push up when lying on their stomach. Then, as we progress to 4 months old, this is where they start to smile more spontaneously. So it's not just gas, but it's just smiling for the sake of smiling. This is where they like to interact with others. So maybe their mom or dad, other caregivers might just go boo, and then they just start to smile. And so really kind of enjoying that interaction. They also copy a lot of movements and facial expressions. So it's a lot of mirroring. So if a parent were to go, ah, they might try to like imitate that as well. For language and communication, this is where they babble with expression, So it's kind of these different intonations and kind of copies the sounds that they hear. So maybe if their caregiver is like, oh, do you want to have a bottle? Like, blah, blah, blah. Like, it's just like that kind of inflection that they're trying to imitate. And then they also try to show more of that expression in terms of communicating through their cries. So they're able to show different cries, their hungry cry, the wet diaper cry, the tired cry, or I'm in pain cry. Here, they're also being able to direct basic facial expressions. So when they're happy, when they're sad, when there's some kind of distress, they also respond positively to affection, like kisses, hugs, cuddling. And there's more of that high hand-eye coordination. So being able to like reach for a toy. They also, in terms of their movement, physical development, more likely to bring their hands to their mouth. So they're kind of exploring that. And then also when it comes to certain toys, they might be shaking a rattle or trying to swing at these dangling toys that are in their crib or on the mobile. All right, and then as we progress to 6 months, this is where they start to recognize familiar faces like caregivers versus strangers. So this is where that stranger anxiety starts to develop. And that's a typical development. So they're able to notice like, oh, I recognize this person versus not. This is where they continue to enjoy playing with others, especially with their parents, kind of trying to do the patty cake, also responding to other people's emotions. So being able to attend to like their caregiver's emotions and knows like, oh, mama or dad or whatnot, like they're happy. And so I'm happy, things like that. And then this is where they start to string vowels together when babbling. So like, oh, 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 oh. And they start to begin to say more consonant sounds. So more of this jabbering, like things like that. And then also they start to recognize their own name. So when someone calls their name, they're able to like attend to it. So turn or indicate something. Cognitively, they show more curiosity about things. So with that curiosity comes a lot of things in their mouth. So that's how they start to explore things. They find an object, put it in their mouth, find food, put it in their mouth. There's a lot of exploring that. So I realize with a lot of people I know, it's a lot of making sure the floor is relatively clean and safe at those times. And then also looking at things nearby, like, oh, there's different things here. Oh, I have legs, like what are these and things like that. And then with movement, physical development, this is where they begin to sit without support. So being able to sit independently because they had that trunk support. They're able to roll in both directions. And then they also are able to rock back and forth. So this is like the emerging skills of crawling where they're up on their legs and hands, and then they're like, oh, here we go. And so about to start that crawling piece there. Then as we go to 9 months old, this is where that stranger anxiety continues on. So they might be afraid of strangers. It's kind of those moments where I know that I have a niece here that I see every once in a while. And there are times that like I come and see her and I realize that she doesn't recognize me yet. And then she'll see me or my husband's her uncle and would just start crying. You're like, oh no, she doesn't like us. It's more of just, she's able to notice that's not mom and dad. That's not someone that she sees every day. So in some ways I like to reframe like, oh, that's good social emotional development in that regard. And then also like continuing on with that, they may be more clingy with familiar adults. So I know that when she sees us, you see that she holds on tighter to her mom. Like, okay, I don't know who this person is. With language and communication, they understand the word no. So for example, if they're trying to reach for something and their caregiver says, no, 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 then they might stop. Like, okay, I'm not supposed to do that. They're able to copy sounds and gestures of others. So that's kind of like the waving. They might imitate that. And this is where they start to use their finger to point at things, to kind of direct attention to other things, to others. Cognitively, this is where they start to understand the concept of peekaboo and really enjoying playing with peekaboo. And then being able to move things smoothly from one hand to the other. They're also able to pick up small things with what we call like a pincer grasp, so the thumb and index finger. And then again, being able to sit without support, even better than the previous time, so even more developed. And then being able to stand while holding onto something or being able to pull themselves to stand. And this is where we see crawling beginning to happen. Then we make it to 1 year. And this is where the social emotional still shy and nervous with strangers. So typical development there. They might also try to repeat sounds or actions to get attention from their caregivers. And then also trying to make more clear requests. So that kind of means that if they want something like a book read to them, they might take the book and give it to their caregiver. So it's kind of indicating like, read this to me. They also can respond to more simple requests as well. So for example, if their caregiver says, give me the book, they can hand over the book. And they also can use those simple gestures on their own, so the waving and things like that. And then they're also able to say mama and dada specifically to those caregivers. And then also they might have exclamations like, uh-oh. So if they drop something and they say, uh-oh, so they know what that meaning is. And then more cognitively, this is where, for example, like with the book, if like their caregiver is mentioning, oh, there's a doggy, then they're able to kind of hone in on that and being able to recognize what that is. Then they're also continuing to be able to move things more smoothly from one hand to another. So continuing on with that, like hand-eye coordination and knowing like, oh, this is different ways that I can obtain things using my hands. And then also being able to poke with their index finger. So that can be like, for example, toys with buttons and poking at it and noticing like, oh, if I poke this, this sound comes. Then continuing to have that great sitting position without help. They can stand alone. And then they may also start to take their first steps independently. Then we get to 18 months or a year and a half. And this is where they can show affection to more familiar people. So kind of those kisses, hugs, cuddles. This is where they start to have those temper tantrums. So part of that typical development. And then we start to see simple pretend play happening. So this is where they might have like a baby doll and take a bottle and being able to show like, oh, I'm feeding the doll. Then with language and communication, this is where they start to have several single words. So they might be able to say no, ball, truck, bottle, milk, things like that. Then they can say and shake their head no. And so being able to integrate those. And then being able to point to show what they want. So for example, if there's something like on the top of the shelf that they want, they can be able to point to that and kind of look at their parent like, hey, can you grab that for me? When it comes to more movement, physical, let's see, where am I? Oh, so with the cognitive part, when it comes to pointing, they can point to different body parts. So for example, if someone says like, oh, where's your nose? They can point to that. They can also point to get the attention of others again, so that being able to show something that they want, being able to attend to certain things. Like for example, kind of taking the communication part as well is, for example, if there's like a plane flying in the sky, they can point to and say like, look. And so being able to kind of direct that attention to their caregiver. They also know the function of everyday objects. So for example, if someone were to give them like a brush, they can take the brush and put it to their head because they know that that's to indicate brushing their hair. They can also follow one-step ungestured commands, meaning that we're just kind of saying it without showing something. So you can just say like, give the ball to mommy, and then they can go ahead and do that and follow that. With movement, physical development, they can walk independently. They can possibly walk up steps and start running. They're able to drink from a cup, eat with a spoon. So having more of that like fine motor development too. Then when it comes to 2 years old, this is where the social skills start to emerge when it comes to peers or other kids. Like they get more excited when there's other children around. They might play beside them and maybe start to engage with them. So there's something called parallel play where they might enjoy the company of other kids, but then this person's playing with this and this person's playing with this. So they might be just playing like side by side. And then this is where that age they start to interact with one another. They also might show defiant behaviors like no, like and then they talk about the terrible twos. That's kind of where that comes from. Then with language and communication, they can say sentences like 2 to 4 words, like maybe more milk, ball please, things like that. They may be able to point to things when named or in a book. So for example, whereas the earlier development, they're able to look at a thing that their parent mentioned. Now, so it's more of the parent saying like, oh, where's the doggy? Then they can point to it like, oh, here it is. They can also know the name of familiar people and also naming the body parts. So you can ask them, what's this? And they can say ear, things like that. Then cognitively, this is where they're able to begin to like sort shapes and colors. They can stack blocks into like a tower with multiple blocks. They can also start to follow two-step instructions. So for example, you could say, oh, go get your backpack and then put on your shoes. And so kind of getting those. And then that's when they also start to play simple make-believe games. So pretending to be an airplane, things like that. Then with motor, physical development, those movements start to kick a ball, throw a ball over a hand. They can walk up and down the stairs while holding on. And then also being able to make or copy straight lines or circles. So really starting to get those fine motor, emerging drawing, writing skills down. Then at 3 years old, they're able to show a wide range of emotions. So not only happy, sad, angry, but maybe more embarrassed, guilty, so more of those complex emotional expressions. They can also show concern for others when those others are hurt or sad. So for example, they might go and hug somebody that's crying. They start to understand different ideas of like, oh, this is mine versus that's his or hers. And then also being able to carry on a conversation using 2 or 3 sentences, so kind of having that back and forth, being able to follow instructions with 2 or 3 steps, and also using those prepositions like put the book on the table and then place your shoes in the shelf. They also know their first name, so when you can ask like, what's your name? They can say it. Their age, and then you can also ask like, are you a boy or a girl? And then being able to recognize that as well. Then cognitively, that's where that more complex play comes into to action. And so being able to play with buttons, levers, moving parts. So when you kind of think about, I think about like the doctor's office, and they have this kind of wired block thing with these like balls or whatever, really kind of getting into that. More make-believe play with dolls, animals, and people, being able to do that. And then also having puzzles like that have 3 or 4 pieces. Then with the movement physical development, this is where they start to climb really well, like climbing onto furniture, climbing off of furniture. They can run really easily, and start to pedal a tricycle as well. Then at the age of 4 years, this is where they become even more creative with that make-believe play. So for example, they might, I think about like preschools or daycares where they have costumes and they play dress up, and they're like, oh, now I'm a firefighter. I'm gonna save that cat from the tree. So those kinds of things. They would rather play with other children than on their own. So more of that interactive play, and being able to talk about their own interests and things that they like. They also start to know more basic rules of grammar, so more plural things like that, and then being able to tell stories. So stories in terms of like a beginning, middle, end. And then also being able to recite like a song or a poem from memory, even like the Itsy Bitsy Spider, and like Old MacDonald Had a Farm. Then with the cognitive part, they start to be able to copy some capital letters and being able to know some colors and numbers as well if you show them. They also remember parts of a story that might have been read to them and start to understand that concept of time. Like, okay, 5 more minutes. And then with the movement, being able to hop and stand on one foot for a brief amount of time, being able to catch a bounce ball most of the time, being able to pour, cut using scissors with supervision, mashing their own food, so gaining those fine motor skills and the whole gross motor skills too. And then lastly, at the age of 5 years, this is where they want to please their friends and be like their friends. And then they're also aware more of their gender too, like what are those differences? And then they're also able to tell what's real versus what's make-believe. in terms of language and communication, this is where their articulation may be better, so being able to speak very clearly, and unfamiliar adults or individuals can better understand them. And then also being able to tell a simple story using full sentences, so really having more of that complex language, using the prepositions and so on and so forth, and being able to use future tense too, like Dad and I will go to the store. And then with the cognitive piece, being able to know how things are used every day, being able to copy like shapes as well, and then counting 10 or more things, so counting it with a 1-to-1 correspondence, and being able to print some letters and numbers, movement, physical development, being able to hop, maybe being able to skip, more of those like activities of daily living with feeding themselves using a fork and spoon, maybe starting to learn how to use a table knife, swinging and climbing as well. And so when this is a lot, it's a lot to remember, there's a lot to keep in mind. And so I know for me, I still refer to these guidelines to figure out like, okay, I'm trying to get a sense of if this child that I'm seeing, are they on track, or are they starting to be a little bit behind compared to other peers? And so I know that what I sometimes do is I refer to the CDC, like I have these printed out like as handouts. I also have, I know that the font's really small here, but as an example, I have like a 1-page sheet that sometimes I'll just put on a board to refer to. So I know that the easiest way to access this is just Googling, searching like child development chart or child development review, and then this usually pops up. So this includes different categories, not only with the things that I talked about, but also more things in detail as well. All right, so since we're talking about all this like typical development, now we can transition to neurodevelopmental disorders. So how we go about defining what that is based off of different resources. So in terms of diagnostic criteria, we mainly use as psychologists the DSM-5, so the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So we're on the 5th edition for that. And there are times where we have something that kind of fits, but maybe not quite, and there's something that can better represent it as well. And so there's also another classification system, which is also included in the DSM-5, I think towards the back of it, that shows these ICD-10 codes. And these are codes that we, through the hospital system, have used to do billing. And so some diagnoses have a DSM-5 and an ICD-10 code, whereas some of them just have an ICD-10 code for that. But we mainly use the DSM-5 first. So to figure out like what are neurodevelopmental disorders, we pull out the different parts of the word. Neuro, more like the brain, neurological piece, and then developmental. This is where we have a group of conditions that affect that neurological piece. So the growth and development of the brain or the central nervous system in general. Developmental, because that typically comes up or manifested, like shown in the early developmental period. So kind of during those milestones that I was talking about. So about the time of like school age or earlier. And then the deficits or differences or difficulties that they may have, maybe more global things like multiple domains or more very specific things. So some examples I'll mention is for the DSM-5, they have different categories. So the first one is intellectual disabilities. So that's more that global, like the reasonings behind those activities of daily living, like being able to feed themselves is behind other milestones as well. And what we use for really young ages, so up until age 5, we use global developmental delay. Because there's certain things that we can assess, but we can't fully assess it until later as they start to acquire more skills. So usually from infancy to 5, like up until 5, we would call that global developmental delay. And then afterwards, especially after interventions and we see that there's continued delays, then we would call it intellectual disability. Another category is communication disorders. So this is related to language. So language disorders, so that might be more difficulties with like speech delays, not being able to say words just yet. when they're supposed to be expected for their age, or having difficulties understanding language as well. And then autism spectrum disorder, which I'll talk about more in detail. Then also ADHD as well. So this can be more about the hyperactive, impulsive type, or more the inattention, or having that combined as well. And then specific learning disorder, this is where we talk more about particular academic areas. So like impairment in reading, like dyslexia, impairment in math, impairment in writing. Then there's motor disorder. So there's more about the tics and Tourette's, and more of these like motor tics, like things that just kind of unintentionally occur with like their motor movements or vocal as well. And then there's just other neurodevelopmental disorders where it's kind of a catch-all category in terms of like someone might have some of this, but we're still trying to figure it out. So to figure out more of what makes something delayed, we use what we call the normal curve or the bell-shaped curve. So this is kind of where we were talking about with those CDC milestones, that this is kind of a range, like a give or take. This sort of reflects that, the normal curve. So with the assessments that we use standardized assessments where, like in the US, with their particular norms, there's a sample of, they try to create a large sample from across the country, ideally, of kids of a particular age. And then they administer those tests and then kind of put them into this bell-shaped curve. And so typically, there is this bell-shaped curve distribution here. So I know there's a lot of numbers, so I'll just kind of break it down. So for example, if we were to have a child of a particular age, it's supposed to fall within this. So this is like the higher it is, the more there are, so the higher the frequency. So the majority of kids would fall in what we call this average range. So typically developing age appropriate within age expectations. And then there's also some that fall in that lower end of the average range, some in that higher end of the average range. And then there's fewer, but still present, of those that are below average, below their age expectations. And then conversely, like above average. And when it comes to standardizing assessments, there's different scales that we use, like index scores, or what we call standard scores with these numbers, T-scores, scaled scores, percentile ranks. And so that's what we use mainly in terms of trying to figure out, okay, is this person or this child falling behind? Like, how can we go about determining that? So I know it's a lot and it's a lot of information. I want to refer more to the CDC website again. So not only do they have more things about just development in general, so those milestones that I was talking about, they also include more information about different conditions as well. And so there's more that you can look at. There's a lot of great information. There's a lot that I still have yet to look at. There's also those free materials. So the materials I was talking about in terms of the different languages, research, data, statistics, like all that most up to date. So sometimes I get questions in terms of like, oh, so what's the prevalence rate of blah, blah, blah. Part of it is I can't remember and then have to refer to the CDC or other resources there. Okay, so to talk more about something that I'm very passionate about for autism spectrum disorder, that's going to be a big focus of today's talk. In terms of the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria, so the autism spectrum disorder, or ASD for short, is a neurodevelopmental disorder. So that brain, again, that brain development that's characterized by social communication and interaction difficulties, as well as excessively repetitive behaviors, restricted interests, and insistence on sameness, or what we call collectively as RRBs. So here, this is an MRI, like a brain scan of someone with autism. This is just kind of reflecting that there may be differences. That's something we have to keep in mind. And then puzzles, I'll talk more about that later in the talk. And then also, like for autism as well, especially when we're thinking about providing feedback for patients and like their parents in particular. I'll talk more about this later, but it's also embracing that neurodiversity, and that this is just a different way that your child is seeing the world. And it's a way that, yes, it's a common condition, but it's something that might be more unique compared to a lot of kids their age. So being able to show that they have strengths too, and also trying to recognize that as well. And I know that when it comes to the DSM-5 and other diagnostic criteria, it is looking at more of those deficits, and that's compared to the general public. And that's how it's phrased, but it's kind of keeping that in mind too. All right, so more specifically, so with those persistent deficits or difficulties with social communication and social interaction, to meet this part of the criteria, they have to have difficulties in each of these categories. So having difficulties with that social emotional reciprocity, so having difficulties engaging in a back and forth conversation. So for example, depending on their age, when they're typically expected to have those back and forth conversations. For example, if they were to have somebody talk to them and mention like, oh yeah, that's my favorite book too, and they don't respond, that's something what we call like a drop social bid. So not being able to have those back and forth. And even when they're younger, before they have words, they might, for typically developing kids, have reciprocal babbling. So if like their parent might say go ba 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 ba, they might go ba 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 ba. But then for those that have autism, they may have difficulties even doing that. So it might be just that kind of flat tone that we have. And then also having difficulties when at that certain age being able to comfort others. So for example, if someone is hurt, sad, or crying, they might not notice, they might not be aware. If anything, they might observe and notice something, but then not trying to comfort them. Then with nonverbal communication, where they have difficulties, maybe that inconsistent eye contact. Doesn't mean that they don't have eye contact, period. That could be the case, but it's not as frequent as what we're expecting it to be. So they might have that occasional eye contact, like every once in a while, but when we're kind of just looking at everyday interactions, they're not having as much eye contact as we are expecting. This also includes difficulties with gestures. So maybe they might not wave, they might not like shake their head for no or nod for yes. They might not be able to kind of show that communication non-verbally. Something else that is also a red flag per se for autism is what we call hand as tool. So when we're kind of looking at both of these categories, if they're not being able to like request with an adult like what they want or show what they want, one of the things that they might do is just take their hand and take the person's hand and place it on something. So for example, if they want a water bottle to be opened, they might take their parent's hand and just put it on there. And so it's that assumption that they want that bottle to be open. And for those with autism spectrum disorder, that might be their first line of communication. Whereas for those that may be typically developing, that might be kind of one of those like last resort ones, like, okay, mom, I've been trying to get your attention, and okay, and I just need you to help me. So when it comes to those with autism, that hand as tool might be something that they might beeline towards in terms of their first line of communication or requesting. Then with difficulties with developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships, this is where they might not have interest in same age peers. So sometimes what we hear from parents is that their child instead might have interest in older kids or younger kids. But then having those difficulties with same age is one of those characteristics for ASD. And then also having difficulties approaching other kids, as well as difficulties responding to other kids' approaches. This also fits a category of that play, the interactive play. So maybe wanting to prefer to be alone. Sometimes something that's characteristic of autism that we commonly hear is, oh, my child is in their own world. It's kind of like they're in their own bubble. They're kind of unaware of their surroundings. It's sort of like they could care less that there's someone else in their space. So it's just kind of focused on what they're doing. So having difficulties with that. And also difficulties in terms of looking at different relationships. So difficulties understanding like, oh, this is our parent-child relationship, teacher-student relationship, siblings, friends, so on and so forth. Then when it comes to those RRBs, we need to have at least 2 of these categories filled. So with stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, that can be where there's a hand flapping. This is like repetitive rocking back and forth. That kind of just occurs randomly. Maybe they're watching TV and just rocking back and forth. This could be head banging without having this like functional use to it. It's just kind of randomly happening. This can also be a stereotyped or repetitive use of objects. So kind of like in this picture here, lining up toys, but not for the sake of pretending that the toys are in traffic, like on a freeway or in a parking lot, but it's just lining them up or lining up other things. And then that's their play. And that they might engage in a temper tantrum if you move the car. So having that kind of fixed sort of rigidity with that. And then also stereotyped or repetitive speech as well. So there's a term called echolalia, where they're like a parrot. So I know that early on in those typical developmental milestones where they're learning language and copying sounds, it might sound different. So for example, they might, like a caregiver might ask like, do you want a cookie? And then the typically developing child might say cookie, like learning the word cookie. But then someone with autism, they might say, so for their parent, if they say like, do you want a cookie? They might just respond back, do you want a cookie? So it's just that like immediate parroting that kind of lacks that functional piece. And then also as they get older, where typically developing kids know that like his or her, like third person pronouns or me, I, they may call themselves by third person. So for me, it might be like, oh, Jennifer wants a cookie. Jennifer wants a cake versus I want a cake or I want cookie. Then with insistence on sameness and flexible adherence to routines and ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior, this is where that rigidity shows up a lot more. They want things done a certain way. They have to have a certain routine. There's difficulties in terms of having slight changes in their routines. If so, there might be like a tantrum from that. For ritualized patterns, here, a lot of parents mention like bedtime routines where kids want to make sure there's a stuffed animal and all that. That's what we call more typically developing. That's commonly seen across kids in terms of having a strict bedtime routine that they want to follow, but these could contain other things. So for example, they're very fixed on walking to the park in this direction. They would not want to go in any other direction, or they might tell their parents like to drive a certain way to some certain destination. So kind of that rigidity there. Then with highly restricted or fixated interests, this is where it's like they're obsessed with something. And this could be things that can be unusual for their age. So for example, they might have a strong interest in paper clips or trash. They might just hold on to it, put it in their pocket, and that's it. Or it could be things that we might typically see for kids, for example, like dinosaurs, but then it's to an extreme. Like all they do is talk about dinosaurs. All they want to do is play with dinosaurs. They just want to watch dinosaurs. It might be like they just want to watch YouTube videos of dinosaurs and just like rewinding and watching it over and over and over again. And then also the last category is the hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. So when we're thinking about the 5 senses like touch, sight, smell, taste, sound, it can be where they have a lot of sensitivity to it. So for example, maybe sensitivity to loud sounds that we may not typically see as really loud sounds. Like maybe if there's a toilet flushing, they might cover their ears. And vacuuming, maybe covering their ears. This can also be sensitivity to texture, so that taste. So that's where picky eating can be something that's pretty characteristic of those with autism. And when it comes to that interest, it might be more repetitive things. So for example, having a toy and repetitively pressing the button because they want to hear that sound. Or For example, with more visual pieces, what we call visual interest or inspection, visual inspection. So what they might do is they might look at things at a certain way. So instead of just like looking at, they're like looking under it. Instead of just like examining what it is, it's like something that's a bit unusual, like looking to the side or like peering at it. Something that I also saw in the clinic too is having a toddler that we saw where he would run back and forth. So kind of having that repetitive behavior, but running back and forth, not making eye contact with us, but running back and forth and then looking to the side while they're running and tilting their head. So that's something that shows some kind of sensory thing happening there, some repetitive piece for that. And so when we put this all together, some other diagnostic criteria includes like that like neurodevelopmental part. So where there is symptoms that are present in that early developmental period. And sometimes in the beginning, during early infancy, we might not see it. And it might not show up until later when there's greater demands or expectations socially for their age. And then as they get older, they might be able to pick up on, oh, I'm supposed to do things a certain way. So for example, I think of the Big Bang Theory. So for Sheldon, what he has like in his mind is, oh, someone is upset, so I have to give them a hot beverage, like having those, but then maybe it might be more subtle. So what we typically do is if we are assessing someone that's older than that early developmental period, let's say like an 8-year-old, we would ask during the interview with their parents, like, oh, so for this person at the age 4 or 5, did they do these? And so looking to see if those symptoms were popping up at that age. And then also, if they show a clinically significant impairment, a big part of it is that social functioning piece. And so this is a part where when it comes to interventions for those with autism, it does become important because that might lead to more difficulties down the road. So if there's difficulties with that social piece, that could lead to other disorders or more like psychiatric ones, like anxiety or depression, because they know that something's different. They're having difficulties and not exactly knowing what to do, and that can lead to other distress as well. And then the symptoms are not better explained by intellectual disability or global developmental delay. So what this means is that sometimes those that are developmentally delayed, they might have social expectations or social behaviors that are expected of that, like their age equivalents. This also goes to show that someone can have autism and global developmental delays, and those can be separate. And that can be the same with other neurodevelopmental disorders as well. Like someone may have autism and a language disorder. They might have autism and a specific learning disorder, so on and so forth. So I know that there's another wide range of terms that have popped up in terms of things relating to autism. So Asperger's comes up a lot, autistic disorder more specifically, or PDD-NOS. So those were diagnostic terms or diagnoses that were in previous DSM-5 manuals. So when the DSM-5 was released in 2013, they ended up deciding to put all of those into autism spectrum disorder. And one of the reasons why they did that was because there was a lot of inconsistency in terms of how people were to diagnose this. Like, is that Asperger's or is that not? And it was just a lot more confusing. So they decided just like, okay, we'll just put it all under this umbrella. And then to help reflect those differences, there's also specifiers. And then again, something I have to note is that there can be some inconsistency as well. So I know that with the different clinics that I've been a part of, we don't necessarily always use these specifiers. So for example, when I was in Missouri, we used this pretty regularly, but then at Texas Children's, we didn't. Like, we would talk about it, but we wouldn't necessarily give them particular levels. But it does help kind of reflect the diversity of autism. So with level 1, this shows that there is some support they need, but they can function pretty well. It's just some of these minor things to level 3 requiring a lot of support. So this can be where they're not able to communicate their needs at all. Like maybe they might engage in tantrums instead. And so they might need a lot of support in trying to learn how to request. There might be a lot of difficulties with other development. So like with the language piece or with motor, just a lot of other things going on. And then with other specifiers, with or without accompanying intellectual impairment. So that's where that intellectual disability or global developmental delay can come into play, as well as a language impairment. So maybe like a language disorder may be warranted as well. And then associated or not associated with medical condition or another neurodevelopmental disorder. So the medical condition, there's a number of neurological conditions that have a high correlation with autism because of the brain and just differences happening with the brain, that there can be some closer connections like epilepsy, seizures, things like that.